Big week on the trade front here in Canada. We got hit with some significant Chinese tariffs. This is on top of our still unresolved and major trade dispute with the Americans. Is Canada getting ground down between the world's two big superpowers? To help break it down for us, we are joined by Sean Speer, my co-founder here at the Hub for the weekly roundtable. Sean, great to be in conversation.
Yeah, it's always great to be in touch, Rudyard. Oftentimes, I'm coming to you, as many of our listeners and viewers know, from New York City, where I spend a lot of time because of my wife's work. But I'm pleased to report that I'm speaking to you today from Lorniel, Ontario. It's great to be back on this side of the border, notwithstanding some of the big trade challenges facing the country.
Yeah. So, full disclosure here, Sean, you got a bit of an inside track on this whole, canola crisis, frankly, that we've seen this week. A surge in the Chinese tariffs, up over 70%, completely punitive. As it happens, your father-in-law is the former head, if I've got it right, of the canola kind of association, the group that represents all the canola farmers across Canada. So let's go right to the proverbial horse's mouth. No derogatory intention there vis-a-vis your father-in-law, but what's he saying? What are people on the ground in the industry saying about these tariffs and just how potentially punishing they are to this major Canadian agricultural export and commodity?
Yeah, the Chinese haven't been delicate in terms of their response to Canada matching the Americans on the 100% tariffs on electric vehicles. They've gone directly at one of Canada's major exports, a huge comparative advantage for the country, a major industry, and in so doing, essentially signal not just to us, Rudyard, but I think a lot of other countries around the world who are presently going through this process of making judgments about which camp they want to belong to in an increasingly balkanized world. And the message from the Chinese is, in effect, if you want to go the route of joining the American camp, just know that there are going to be cost and consequences with respect to our own relationship. It really highlights the fast pace and evolving kind of geopolitical chessboard and the inherent risks for middle power countries like Canada that they effectively get squeezed between these two superpowers.
Yeah, so many different ways to take this, but let's begin by just informing our audience. Because look, I'm coming to you out of our studios here in Toronto at Hub HQ, and to be frank about my knowledge of canola and agriculture in the West, it's pretty minimal. And I think, frankly, my lack of knowledge here is some ways reflected in our current response about these tariffs. It's all seemingly about a lot of big industries here in central Canada: aluminum, autos, steel. This is a big industry. Like canola alone, as I understand it, Sean, has tens of thousands, maybe well over 100,000 jobs that are directly connected with this one commodity, with this one export.
That's right. There's a lot of attention in Canada these days to developing homegrown firms or homegrown technologies. Canola is one, Richard. It was a commodity or a product conceived in Canada and one where we have huge market share throughout the value chain. And so, as I say, the Chinese haven't, in responding to Canada, they've gone directly at this major advantage or major asset the country has, and one for which, although there's been efforts, Rudyard, in recent years to shift markets so we're not as dependent on China when it comes to canola. The truth is, it remains a major one for the industry, and so it's kind of in a way analogous to a lot of the debates that we're having about the United States, the extent to which we or have an asymmetrical economic relationship with these countries, and when push comes to shove, both are increasingly prepared to kind of exercise that
Yeah.
leverage and power.
Yeah, and let me connect this conversation to an excellent article that we had in the Hub this week by Peter MacKay, our former defense minister, really outlining what, in a sense, was a lost decade for Canada in terms of international relevance, and most importantly, like any international heft when it came to powers like China and their perceptions of Canada. And frankly, even now, you could say the United States, to the extent that the United States has now become, not maybe a direct threat to our sovereignty, but a challenge to our independence. And I wonder, Sean, I worry when I read these stories about China that Canada must be perceived, is it not, as the kind of weak member of the G7 herd. If you wanted to look at the kind of struggling deer at the back of the pack that's maybe not keeping up economically, certainly not carrying its weight in terms of any military resources or capacity, and frankly, you might say a country that looks from the outside, especially for China, who's interfered a lot in our elections and our democracy, is a pretty divided country, a country that's ripe for a foreign power to come into and try to kind of influence and push it around from the inside as well as the outside. Are we courting, Sean? Is this more than just Trump tariffs? Are we kind of courting the consequences of the last 10 years of frankly, tuning out about all these issues and downgrading the importance of having real power to project internationally, economically, militarily, culturally, and otherwise?
I think that's right, Roger. Canada for a long time has had the luxury of taking foreign and defense policy and national security policy for granted. But that was really, I think, marked over the past decade or so. The Trudeau government, as we've often discussed, was really animated by what you'd characterize as Section 92 issues primarily in the domain of our provinces: childcare, healthcare, dental care, pharmacare. The list goes on. And that focus, both with respect to political capital, but also hard capital, public dollars, went disproportionately to those areas at the expense of Ottawa's core responsibilities around the issues of projecting Canadian interests and power abroad. That consequence is now manifesting itself. We have overwhelmingly chose butter over guns, and that comes with a cost, and I think those costs are playing out right now. I would just make one other point before I turn it back to you, though. I mentioned in a previous answer the notion of geopolitical chess. I think there's something to that. The Carney government is understandably focused on our negotiations with the U.S. A lot of its energy is focused on the bilateral relationship between Canada and America. But we have to understand that this is playing out in this broader context. And so we haven't really heard from the Carney government. It's sort of poised towards China. You'll recall that for most of the Trudeau years, the government was sort of predisposed to strengthening Canada's economic relationship with China. It was only in the face of this overwhelming evidence that China was targeting us economically, diplomatically, and indeed within our elections that the Trudeau government started to talk a tougher game. We had an Indo-Pacific strategy that spoke more plainly about China as an adversary than, frankly, any Canadian government had up to that point. And so it's a long way of saying it's not enough just to focus narrowly on Canada-US. In a way, what we need to hear from the Prime Minister is a kind of theory of the case, what he thinks about this new geopolitical moment, and how Canada is going to manage what is increasingly these tensions between Canada, U.S. and China spilling out and having collateral damage in the case of Canada and other middle powers.
Yeah, well, to wrap up this segment, I mean, my advice would be like, the mistake we've made is like the lack of optionality, right? And you can say, yes, trade diversification is really difficult. It's going to take a long time. But I would go back and look at the origins of these canola tariffs. They are directly related to the punishing 100% tariffs that we placed on Chinese EVs around a completely misguided strategy to try to create in Canada, through tens of billions of dollars of public subsidies, an electric battery car industry. So not just, the batteries, but the cars also. And look, there were potentially reasons to do that. The Biden administration was, flooding the zone with money in the United States to prop up EV car manufacturers and battery manufacturers. There in Canada exists an integrated market when it comes to cars. But 12 months, 16 months later, wow, does this look like a bad bet on a whole bunch of fronts? The EV market has collapsed. There's very little demand for these cars. The Trump administration has pulled off almost all the Biden era subsidies for the industry, removing, in a sense, what was effectively the profit margin for most of these companies. And now Canada is kind of holding an empty bag in terms of this EV strategy that Justin Trudeau, spent the proverbial farm on. And at the same time, not only does the strategy on EVs collapse, but it courts this response from China on canola, on this other major, and as you're right, another kind of place where we actually did own a big part of a value chain inside a single commodity, in this case, canola and canola seed. So, Sean, let's have you wrap this up by just, giving some thoughts. Like, how do we learn from our mistakes in the past? Because I think the EV thing really has become a kind of morality play for what not to do in this new geopolitical world that we're in, where we're wedged between two big powers, each of whom see us as weak. And when you bet the farm or you put all the chips on red, you're creating more risk for yourself rather than de-risking the situation that you now face.
Yeah, brilliant. I could talk about this for a while. I mean, just to kick it off, your point is such a good one. In effect, we preferenced a non-market supported value chain, one that essentially depended on this mix of protection and subsidies at the expense of a genuinely market supported value chain where we had, as you say, significant advantage on the world. I'd make 2 points though, if you'll permit me. The first speaks to that one, that the EV concept, the vision was always basically a fraud. If you think about it, it was completely artificially manufactured by the government. It started with production subsidies. It involved subsidies for consumers. If those weren't enough, it was a mandate that all vehicles had to be sold by 2035. And then to ensure that Canadians were buying these subsidized EVs, the government essentially blocked incoming EVs from China. So from production, from supply to demand, this was completely made up by the government, and it's not a surprise that it's failed, and it ought to be a kind of challenge to those who think that it's easy for government to essentially create these sectors out of their imagination. The second point, though, speaks to something we've talked about in the past. I don't want to sound immodest, but I think we were raising skepticisms about the tariffs on Chinese EVs from the get-go. And it was for this reason, Rudyard. We're both pretty hawkish on China. I'm open to a government policy that says that there are certain goods and products and technologies that we don't want to be importing from China, like semiconductors or wireless technology or whatever. But there are a lot of products that don't represent a national security threat or a threat to our national interest. And we didn't have a kind of framework for the government to understand why EVs were more like semiconductors than they were, say, like T-shirts or something. And I think that only reinforced that this was a highly politicized decision, one that was essentially trying to support the huge subsidies that the government had already dumped into the EV industry. And now we see the net effect, the collateral damage, is our canola industry, which is we've discussed, is actually a huge advantage for Canada. So it's a long way of saying, in a lot of ways, this strikes me as a failure of industrial policy and a failure on the part of the Trudeau government to articulate a kind of vision for Canada's place in this increasingly fraught geopolitical world.
Yeah, I think the lesson has to be flexibility, optionality. You have to have off-ramps and on-ramps. You should not be committing yourself unless forced, unless your back is up the wall, unless the threat of a 35% across-the-board tariff, that blows CUSMA NAFTA up and really it represents a fundamental threat to your economy vis-a-vis the United States, well, then we'll have to address that when we have to address that. But before then, look, like you, what the Chinese did to the two Michaels was reprehensible. What they've done in our elections and our democracy is reprehensible. But we have to be clear-eyed about these things, and we have to understand that, we're playing on a different chessboard right now, and this is not a place for novices. This is not a place for idealism. This is a place for some hard-headed realism, and we're going to have a relationship with China. We're going to have to figure this out, and there will be places where there will be red lines that need to be drawn. I just don't think EVs were one of them, and now, as you say, huge collateral damage to the canola industry. It introduces regional divisions because you have an industry in Ontario that's eliciting these tariffs on an industry from Western Canada. The Prime Minister had to rush forward this week under some political pressure and duress to now announce more subsidies, this time for canola farmers. So everybody's getting subsidies: steel producers, aluminum producers, car manufacturers, canola farmers, the list goes on and on. That is not a sustainable strategy. That is not a way that you can run an economy or a country for any length of time, especially when you're elbows down and you're not collecting retaliatory tariffs to pay for all of these subsidies that are going out the door, to kind of put together Humpty Dumpty, when I just think that's not going to happen anymore. We need some new thinking, and there's going to be some challenging times ahead. I'll give you the last word, Sean.
Yeah, I think we may have a title for today's episode: Canada is losing the geopolitical chess game. And the other thing I'd say is all of this to say, I think my father-in-law is feeling pretty good that he's retired and not having to deal with these, these really fundamental questions facing an important industry for Canada.
For sure. Okay, let's say goodbye to our complimentary listeners and viewers. We're going to join Hub heroes and fellows, our subscribers, for the back half of the roundtable this week. We're going to talk about the spectacular meltdown of one of our major cultural institutions in Canada. Yes, that is the Toronto International Film Festival. Had an acute case of foot and mouth disease this week, and we're going to break it all down and kick it around with our Hub donors and subscribers right after this break. So if you're not a donor or subscriber, you can become one right now at www.thehub.ca. We'll send you an email immediately to listen to the back half of the roundtable on your favorite podcast app. And for subscribers who are watching the video version right now, that second half of the roundtable is only available as an audio product. That will change in September, and we're excited to bring you the full-length edition video versions to all of our paid subscribers through our website. So here's that. Bye-bye.